Please be warned, this episode contains graphic descriptions of violence and atrocities against people, which may be alarming to some listeners.
We were standing near the camp kitchen building one morning, ready to march out. Taking advantage of the free moment, one of the prisoners, Paul, lit a cigarette. This was a crime because of the ban on smoking. To our misfortune, the Lagerführer was nearby and noticed the smoke rising above the heads of the prisoners. He obviously failed to spot the smoker because he walked over and pointed the 3 rows of 5. He ordered that the numbers of these 15 prisoners be taken down. The miscreant Caltrip was clearly among them. I was one of them. I was called down to Camp Schreibstube, mine administrative office, the following day and informed that for smoking I had been sentenced to 4 days of penal labor, which took place on the Sundays. When I tried to protest and stated that I was non-smoker, one of the administrators, Paul, said that my protest would have no effect. A report had been submitted to the main administrative office and I would have to pay the penalty. So it was. I performed my penalty for the next 4 Sundays. Penalty labor had to be done on the empty stomach. The prisoner received no meals on these days. I need not explain what that meant to a hungry prisoner who had to work on Sunday instead of having a day of rest and, in addition, was deprived of that miserable meager amount of food.
Hello, welcome back to episode 8 of, the Auschwitz Liberation podcast. The liberation was on the 27th, and we're now going to spend the next 2 episodes talking, first one talking about the aftermath, meaning what's happening with the Red Cross, the War Crimes Commissions burying dead, the NKVD camp, museum, and things like that. And then the next episode we'll be talking about will be post-war trials, which is really, really interesting because we will be having some arguments amongst each other. But before we do get to this episode, we had the testimony at the beginning that was read by Ulrich Uliark, who was a Czech prisoner who arrived at Auschwitz. He held the number 25617. A lot of you may have seen footage of Auschwitz being liberated, the famous stuff you see all over YouTube, and I posted some actually on my Twitter, my social media about it. That film was actually filmed a couple of days after the liberation of Auschwitz. One of the cameramen was Captain Alexander Vorontsov, one of the Soviets. He arrived and he filmed everything that he saw as he went along. He conducted lots of interviews with various different eyewitnesses, but the problem here is these interviews, they were really, really, really short in small, tiny pieces because these survivors, you've got to remember, they're broken, they're starved, they're malnutritioned, and they have no energy. Their strength was so low that they couldn't speak. And obviously, we've got to also remember this film footage is being done by the Soviets. There's a lot of war censorship in place at this time. He'd already seen a lot as he was moving in with the Soviet army, but in his quote, it says, "My memories from there have stayed with me all my life." All of that was the most moving and horrific thing that I filmed during the war. So there we go, all that film footage, it's not staged, but it was just filmed later on after the camp was liberated. There is no film footage of the actual physical liberation. We don't have it, but we do have especially photographs, aftermath photographs, and that's exactly what Kate's going to be talking about, because we'll be talking about the War Crimes Commission. What did they do? Where did they go with this? What was the purpose of it? Because this is also going to link to the next episode. So Kate, what is the War Crimes Commission? What is it all about? Tell us.
What you would hope the War Crimes Commission is about is justice. Justice for the murdered, justice for the victims. So we'll come on to that. The War Crimes Commissions started in February and March, so very, very soon after the liberation. They were taken out by the First Ukrainian Front, who began to investigate the crimes committed at Auschwitz. And they were acting under the supervision of the Extraordinary State Commission of the Soviet Union for the investigation of the crimes of the German fascist aggressors, which rolls off the tongue nicely, doesn't it? They carried out on-site inspections of the former concentration and extermination camp. They looked at the buildings, the locations of the crematoria, the incineration pits near Crematorium 5, where, if you remember a few episodes back, I talked about them trying to hide the ashes and the bone fragments under a layer of soil. Well, that was turned up quite quickly. And they also secured evidence of the crimes committed. Again, I mentioned about the SS trying to burn Canada and the belongings in Canada, and that not quite working. So they uncover lots and lots of plundered property of victims, which the SS had not managed to either burn or ship to Germany. I would like to give you some figures here because it's quite astonishing. There's 1.2 million items of clothing, 43,500 pairs of shoes, almost 70,000 cooking utensils, 50,000 brushes of various sorts, shaving brushes, boot brushes, hair brushes. There were 5,500 talliths, over 3,000 suitcases, and almost 13,000 pairs of spectacles. They also found about 7 tons of human hair, predominantly women's hair, which was found in the warehouses of the former camp's tannery. So these materials were collected up by the commission, and they were used by the Supreme National Tribunal in trials against members of staff at Auschwitz, 40 members of camp staff, and the former commandant Rudolf Höss. The commission interviewed about 200 former prisoners on subjects concerning their existence in the camp, methods of extermination, the medical experiments, treatment of prisoners, living conditions, and the forced labour that they had to undertake. And the investigators also secured whatever documents were left at Auschwitz. These now sit within the Auschwitz collection. They were taken to the Soviet Union. They also had a forensic commission who medically examined 2,800 survivors, and they were able to diagnose them with medical conditions that they'd acquired as a result of being in the camp. So the most common ailment was malnutrition, but there was also tuberculosis, there was inflammation of the skin, of the organs, and even frostbite. Remember, it's January, Poland. It was bitterly, bitterly cold. They also carried out about 500 post-mortem examinations and came to the conclusion that most of the deaths have resulted through maltreatment, malnutrition, and starvation. On the 7th of May 1945, so actually the day before VE Day, the Extraordinary State Commission published their findings in the Soviet newspaper called Pravda in an article entitled "On the Heinous Crimes Committed by the German Government in Auschwitz." It included a description of the camp, of the buildings, the process of mass extermination in the gas chambers, the experiments that were conducted on prisoners. And it also mentioned the countries where the victims had been deported from, but it didn't state their nationality or ethnicity. And this is something we find as the war trials continue and evidence starts to come out of Auschwitz. It's very confused by the fact it's dealt with by the Soviet Union. So they never mentioned that Jews were the largest number of victims. They also come to a conclusion that about 4 million people were killed or died at Auschwitz. We now know that the figure has changed quite significantly, but this figure was based on interviews with former prisoners, as well as the estimated capacity of the crematoria. However, there was the significance of interruptions and other irregularities, if you want to call them that, in the process of mass murder that was not taken into account. Now, this figure of 4 million became symbolic. It was soon entrenched in the public consciousness. I'm reading material now that's trying to explain why this figure has changed over the years, but it's the changing political landscape in the late 1980s when the Iron Curtain fell and when proper historical research into the subject of the death camps and the camps in Poland was now possible. So that figure does change. And that's why. We now have a testimony of Krystyna Szymanska, who was a worker of the Krakow division of the Main Commission for the Investigation of German Crimes in Poland.
The work of our commission entailed inspecting the camp buildings, interviewing former prisoners, and gathering and securing evidence of the committed crimes, especially camp documents. All the commission members were very much engaged in the gathering of documents. We searched for them in diverse parts of the camp. They lay strewn on the ground, on the floors of various rooms, in large amounts, especially in the camp administration building. George Sen said we had to collect all pieces of paper that had any writing. Only later would we decide which ones were useful. So that was what we did. We pulled camp documents out of the rubbish, even out of the latrine. We put them into paper sacks. From time to time, our truck would deliver batches to Krakow. Sometimes there were so many newly delivered documents from Auschwitz that we had to work overtime to get them all sorted out and restored. In the repairing of damaged documents, we were assisted by the Krakow Institute of Forensic Research. An employee of this institute, Dr. Nowicki, removed the dirt from the documents and read their content.
That was a really interesting testimony. I want to quickly 2 seconds come back to the statistic, because Franciszek Piper is the one who actually did the research and managed to get it down to 1.1 million people who died. And, it's still an estimated figure. Obviously, we don't know exactly how many people. We don't know exactly how many Poles or Polish Jews, for example, died, because we don't have the manifests for it. We do have the manifests, for example, from France and from Holland and Belgium and things like that, because the Germans left that kind of evidence behind. But when you're talking about Będzin, Sosnowiec, and all of those ghettos, even Łódź or Lichtenstadt ghetto, you don't know how many Jews were being sent to Auschwitz. And it's the same thing when it comes down to Sobibór, Belzec, Treblinka, and all of those camps where, again, you don't know exactly how many people died because we don't have manifests. They just didn't care about the Polish Jews that were being sent there. So that's where it becomes really complicated. And this is what those crazy people on the internet are like, oh yeah, well, it was 4 million people. That's what Auschwitz says. That's what Auschwitz says. It's like, hold on a second. Do you not understand the context? No, they don't understand the context of this. Anyway, rant over. Should we move on to Chris? Sorry, a long rant over for that. Because I get really irritated. Kate said everything amazing. It's not what Kate said. It's to do with these silly people on the internet that like poking holes into that number of 4 million.
Well, it's not even that, is it? I mean, I'm reading the Deborah Lipstadt book at the minute, and historians say, how can you change the figure? Well, just think about it for a split second. The world has changed, the landscape has changed. We could do a whole episode on that.
Yeah, I think we could just sit here and rant about it, but it's, yeah. Anyway, Chris, talk to us about the Polish Red Cross. Why are they here? What are they doing? And where are they going with what they're doing?
Well, firstly, before we get to the Polish Red Cross, we need to talk about the Soviets. And the good thing about the Soviet army is there's hundreds of them. And so they've got a lot of manpower that they can use, they can spare. And after the liberation and the fronts rolled on, they're able to dedicate serious manpower to providing first aid and medical assistance to the, I don't want to use the word prisoners because they're not prisoners anymore, former inmate, of the victims who are in the camp complex. I mean, there's some 4,800 sick in the camp out of the 7,000 who were liberated. So the Soviets are the first ones on the scene with their first aid, with the medical teams. Then the Polish Red Cross come in shortly after, as do sort of local population to try and assist now that the Germans have definitely gone. And the main priority is to try and treat the sick, to get them well enough that they're able to travel, get them out of Auschwitz, get them away from the disease, and just try and get them, if possible, to go home. Problem is, they haven't got any facilities, so they set up 3 camp hospitals in existing buildings, one in Birkenau, one in Monowitz, and one in the main camp. And as I said, they're trying to get them up to physical fitness. They do eventually, because this isn't going to be an overnight thing, they do actually manage to build some dedicated hospital buildings for them, or dedicated blocks for them. Anyone who's in a serious condition is taken to Krakow, where they can be taken to a proper hospital rather than a makeshift one. There's also quite a few problems with corpses and disease, and so we're going to Kate's going to talk about the burying the dead, but this becomes quite a priority to try and make the place sterile. They also try to treat children there briefly for the first couple of months, and then they try to move them on as well as soon as they're physically able to. And then from June, the size of the Polish Red Cross hospital is slowly reduced as sort of the number of the patients are getting well enough to move on. And when they do move on, they're given a because they've got no paperwork. As far as the Nazis are concerned, they don't exist anymore. So all paperwork was incinerated. Even the evidence that they were sort of camp evidence of that they were at Auschwitz was destroyed. So the Polish Red Cross actually provide each of the liberated with a certificate to say that they've been in Auschwitz, and name and data to just to put them back on the map, as it were. And as they left, they were given sort of some dry rations for about 3 to 4 days. And in some cases, they were also given a small amount of money to help pay them on the way. They also organised transports to try and get them to rail hubs so that they could then be moved on through, well, Europe is shattered, but at least by sort of June 45, the war's over, and so that they are able to sort of travel home. And the different Allied armies and Allied powers are trying to get refugees back home or as close to home as possible during this period. So, I mean, it's an absolute mess, but the Red Cross are doing absolute wonders to try and bring these people up to health and get them home and get them back to family where they can. And next up, we have a testimony from Lydia Plionska.
It was very difficult to maintain appropriate levels of cleanliness in the patient's room. The sick constantly soiled the blankets covering the mattresses. We had to throw them out as rubbish and organize new blankets and mattresses from neighboring abandoned blocks. The patients were so famished that they quite literally threw themselves onto the meals that were brought to them. Whoever could stay on their feet pushed and shoved to get to the cauldrons with food. This situation was virtually impossible to control. For instance, it was very difficult to explain to the sick that there would be enough food for all of them. We almost had to fight to prevent them from eating too much, and this was to protect them against diarrhea. In the sick rooms, Polish Red Cross nurses were on duty day and night. During the night shift, there were around 150 patients to every nurse, and therefore, inevitably, the nurses were unable to reach all those in need of assistance. Thus, every morning, the first thing we did was to climb up on top of each bunk to see if the patient lying there was still alive. If there was a corpse, we would take it down and carry it to the mortuary.
So, as Chris mentioned, we need to talk about the burial of the corpses, the bodies that were left at Auschwitz. On the sites of the former camps of Auschwitz I and Birkenau, there were over 600 corpses of prisoners, either murdered by the SS or who died at the beginning of evacuation or shortly afterwards, that were around the camp perimeters, I guess. Initially, these bodies were taken to an improvised mortuary in Block 11, which had been the punishment block in Auschwitz I, or in Birkenau, they were taken to a trench in the B2F sector, and there were also pits at the end of the railway ramp. That was where the bodies of those who died soon after the liberation were also deposited. About a month after liberation, the 28th of February 1945, there was a funeral for those victims organised by the local administration and by military authorities. And it was attended by several thousand inhabitants of Auschwitz and surrounding villages. There were former prisoners, representatives of the Polish and Soviet military authorities, as well as local clergy. In a very solemn procession, mourners carried coffins with the bodies of the deceased prisoners from Birkenau to a grave next to the former Auschwitz I camp. And quite symbolically, only one small coffin containing the body of a child was transported by hearse. The bodies of prisoners found in Block 11 were buried in a neighbouring grave, and later smaller graves were dug near the existing large ones to bury the bodies of those who died in the care of the Polish Red Cross or in the field hospitals. Marcin Siemian, who was the first post-war mayor of Auschwitz, gave us this quote. He said several thousand inhabitants of the town of Auschwitz and surrounding areas participated in the funeral. The coffins were made of white, planed planks with very basic covers, making the coffins look like simple boxes. 2 or more bodies were laid into each of the coffins. These coffins were then arranged in a single row along the side of the camp road to the left of the gate of death. On top of each one were placed several sprigs of spruce. Prior to a procession, a short speech was held. The procession was led by priests from Auschwitz district, with Prelate Jan Skarbek among them. They were followed by former prisoners in striped uniforms who still remained in the camp and were now waiting for their turn to leave. Next, an honorary company of Soviet troops with orchestra, then the orchestras of the railway workers and the coal miners of the Brescia coal mine, the delegations of various social organizations, country girls in traditional folk costumes, and ordinary people. They all wanted to pay their last respects to the victims of the Nazi regime. The coffins were carried in ranks of 3 by the inhabitants of Auschwitz and surrounding areas. At the head drove a hearse with a small child-sized coffin. The boy was around 2 and was then the youngest victim found in the camp. The grave was excavated by German prisoners of war near the main camp, and it was a wide ditch measuring around 30 by 10 metres. The coffins were arranged around the grave. Speakers of the grave at the grave included the chief Soviet prosecutor, myself as the mayor of Auschwitz, Prelate Skarbek, and representing the former prisoners, a professor from Krakow, whose name I do not remember. To the sound of snare drums and Chopin's funeral march, the coffins were buried. And now we have another testimony from Anna Hjomitz.
Before the liberation and for some time afterwards, we had to carry corpses of fellow inmates who died of exhaustion out of the blocks. After our intervention, the Soviet authorities started removing all the bodies from the entire camp premises. An escorted group of Volksdeutsch was also made to dig a mass grave and carry the bodies. Into this grave were laid corpses from the women's hospital mortuary and other parts of the sector. Not all the bodies could be removed at once. The mass grave was at the end of the railway ramp in Birkenau. One day, newly arrived Soviet soldiers ordered me to show them where this grave was. We were then accompanied by a member of a Soviet film crew as well as Adolf Forbert, who was a Pole. The crew filmed me talking about my experiences and pointing to the corpses with my hand. This moment was later included in the film Liberation Chronicle.
Also at this time we have, very understandably, there prisoners who are able to leave, who just want to leave, and there's no need for them to stay in the camp as well. The Soviets and the Polish Red Cross have got their hands full of dealing with the sick and dying. So those that are able to leave are encouraged to do so, and they are transported by the Soviets by trucks to railheads. And then if they're from Eastern Europe, especially from Russian areas, they're divided into 2 groups. Men who are physically able are then pressed into the Soviet armed forces in reserve battalions, because they still need to defeat the fascist invader. Any women or children are vetted by the NKVD and interrogated as to what they've been through, so make sure that they haven't been corrupted by Western ideals, which is what they did to their soldiers at the end of the war as well, before giving them a certificate and then giving them transport back home. The same with anyone from a Western allied country, or they weren't vetted by the NKVD, but they were sort of passed along by them. There was a slight issue if you were trying to get to Italy or Yugoslavia, because the Germans were still fighting there well into early May. So the Russians were using transit camps, and it must have been quite terrifying in a way that you've just come out of a concentration camp and then you're being put into another camp. But obviously the conditions are going to be a lot better in a Russian transit camp. And then this process went on for many, many months as people got better. But the big problem was with children, because a lot of the children didn't have their parents. Some of them didn't even know where they'd come from. And, when they've been captured and sort of sent to Auschwitz at the age of 2 or 3, they may not know where home is. Their parents are gone. And so a lot of them were taken to local Polish towns and cities where they were put up for adoption and looked after in orphanages. And up next, we have a testimony from Pavel Viktek, who was deported to Auschwitz in transport of Jews from Silna on the 19th of September 1942, and he was given prisoner number 64578, employed in the digging of canals, and as a member of the Camp Fire Brigade. In January 1945, he avoided evacuation and was liberated.
After liberation, I immediately left the camp and set off on foot. We walked to Monowice and then to Krakow. I was pretty exhausted, and in addition, I had numerous injuries, a broken rib and fractured bones in my right hand. I reached Krakow 4 days later. Our host was Dr. Kowalski, a professor of the Jagiellonia University. I remained in Krakow for 4 weeks. I was treated in a clinic and later I stayed at the Francuski hotel. After returning to Czechoslovakia, I reported to the Czech military brigade.
Well, that brings it to the end for me to talk about this. Now, I might start with a rant, and I do apologise. Everybody, when they think about Auschwitz, thinks about everything we have just spoken about, and that is the War Crimes Commission, that is documenting all the evidence, the Polish Red Cross treating the sick, treating those who are on the verge of death. However, there was a much sinister motive behind all of this, and that is the NKVD established a transit camp on in the Auschwitz main camp, Birkenau, and in another part of Auschwitz. And this is established in between April and May, around that time of 1945. And it's intended for German prisoners of war, Polish citizens of Upper Silesia, Bielsko, where I used to live, Bielsko-Biała, down in the south, and the people in the area who'd signed the Volkslist, basically, during the occupation. So those who identified themselves as German, those who had probably most likely done it to save themselves. This is a very complicated issue because in Polish society, especially amongst the priests and things, people who lived in those areas that had a higher chance of being, German in quotation marks, the priests and the bishops and the cardinals would beg for the Silesians to sign the Volkslist so they could preserve Polish culture, because otherwise, nobody knew what was going to happen to the Polish nation. Anyway, so people did sign the Volkslist. Sometimes they thought it would save their lives. Sometimes it didn't. The same thing to do with the Highlanders. That whole new film that's come out in Poland about, the Highlanders being traitors and whatnot. Much more complicated than being so black and white, basically. So people thought if they signed that list, they could be spared from being deported to concentration camps. Unfortunately, they still were. So this is a very delicate situation that we're going to be talking about here. Anyway, so this camp is subordinate to the NKVD. It was the main camp in Auschwitz I was referred to as Camp 22. The second one was predominantly for prisoners of war, also managed by the NKVD. This was on the grounds of the former women's camp in Birkenau, in sections B1A and B1B on the left-hand side as you walk into the camp, if you were to go there now. This one existed from the spring of 1945 to the spring of 1946. So in a total, this lasted for a whole year. So at the same time that people are being, nursed back to health, you've got these camps operating literally right next door. Who ran it? It was ran by, in Polish, we would say Państwowy Urząd Bezpieczeństwa, right? Basically UB, and that's how I'm going to refer to it. Horrible organization. We need another podcast to talk about them because, this is something I can talk about for hours. They were the ones who basically ran the camp for, in quotation, Poles. Their transit camp and the main camp more probably existed till about autumn of 1945, then the one in Birkenau for about a whole year. So we're talking about one was 6 months, one was about a year. There was another camp that existed, and those are in the buildings that were formerly and I can't speak German, so mind, these guys are struggling with their Polish. I'm now going to struggle with my German. Geheimenschlafslager, which Chris is probably going to correct me in a moment. It was a camp for conscript labourers, and that is where one of the other camps was opened. That was opened in the early spring of 1945. Later, it was transferred to Jaworzno, which is a town further into Silesia, in May of the following year. So again, it operated for give or take about a year as well. Right next door, you had the UB headquarters, which occupied 3 blocks, and they put people suspected of disloyalty to the Polish state. So that should tell you pretty much what the Soviets were doing already, trying to get rid of Poles exactly the same way the Germans were doing. We've got to remember, this was one occupation swapped for another. This is how dark this place still is, more than a year after it had been liberated. So, prisoners of war and civilians were held in all 3 camps. They were used to do groundskeeping work, dismantling wooden barracks, disassembling equipment and installations of the former IG Farben factory. And I will give you one guess what was happening with all of this equipment. Well, it was being shipped to the Soviet Union. The Soviets basically came into all of these areas where you had all of these factories, you had all of these mines. They dismantled everything. They cleared Poland out. Any equipment, even if it belonged to the Polish government, to the Polish nation, forget it. It was all being moved out to the Soviet Union. So literally they were just moving everything into the Soviet Union. And we're not just talking about equipment from factories. We're talking about farming equipment. We're talking about absolutely everything and anything that could be dismantled and taken apart was taken into the Soviet Union. Anyway, the Poles from Upper Silesia who were kept there, they'd been conscripted under duress by the Wehrmacht. And this is, again, a whole other kettle of fish that we don't have time to talk to in this podcast. The people that were interned also included Poles that had been detained by Soviets during these mopping up operations behind the front lines in the areas of Bielsko, Biała, Rybnik, Racibórz, all of those areas in the south of Oświęcim, basically, people who had been suspects of the opposition to the new communist political order. And this was happening throughout the whole of Poland, not in this area, not just only in this area. And people would still be persecuted in Poland and sentenced to death up until 1952. The last deportation into Siberia of Poles was in 1952, just before Stalin died. Anyway, the Soviet authorities would regularly come into the camp. They would look for people that were capable of physical work. They'd be sent by rail to gulags, of course, because gulags are still functioning at this point. They do not stop. And again, everything that was not bolted down was considered a spoil of war. And what's really interesting is that sorry that I'm laughing, but the Soviets decide to try and take the Arbeitsmacht Gate. And some of you may remember when it got stolen a couple of years ago by some neo-Nazi who wanted it for his collection. And now the original actually is kept inside the museum. So the one you kind of see when you go in there is a fake. It's a replica. It's not real. But the real one was actually taken by the Soviets. And one of the former prisoners, he came from, I think, either the second or the third transport in June of 1940. And he kind of convinced one of the Soviets that he needed to take him back. And he basically took it and took it home. It's a really funny story. Funny, but it's not funny at the same time. Anyway, moving on, these camps held no more than 25,000 people. Their commandant was a Soviet colonel. They were predominantly classed as transit camps, where most of these German prisoners of war were placed before they were transported to labour camps in Soviet Union and into gulags. What's really interesting is that in August and September 45, Soviets freed some of the Poles that were interned in the camp. Over 10,000 were freed. And this is because the new Polish authorities came to the conclusion that Poles should not be repressed. And that was only, well, they seem to think the reason this came about was because there was a secret letter written to the head of the Silesian district, to General Alexander Zawadzki, and they wrote, quote, "There are 12,000 of us in the camp as civilian Poles and prisoners of war of the former German army. The fate of us Poles is unknown. Recently, over 400, included in the second working group, were sent together with German prisoners of war to an unknown destination." So they sent this letter in secret, and then the Polish authorities got themselves involved and, released as many as they could. There were nearly 150 people that were recorded dead in this NKVD camp, predominantly coming from Upper Silesia and Bielsko-Biała area. They were buried in the local cemetery, and we still don't know where they're buried. And on the banks of the nearby Soa River, which is really interesting because not long ago they found bones that are kind of sticking out of the bank because the bank has been eroded, and it's been discovered that these are not prisoners. These are, as in prisoners from the Auschwitz concentration camp. It's from post-war, basically. So it's those people that were just kind of dumped in the nearby river. Anyway, the German prisoners who ended up there were predominantly malnourished. They would die from diseases, war wounds, but there is no mention of them being killed. So they just kind of were left to their own devices, really, and just and worked more or less to death. One of the former German POWs, Uli Scholz, wrote in a statement that was sent to the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum, where he said he was kept in the camp complex. He said, "I wanted to say that I do not feel hatred towards Polish and Russian people, because when I learnt about these camps, especially Auschwitz, I understood the great pain and suffering that the criminal fascist Germany inflicted on Polish, Jewish and other citizens." And then this is more or less where we end with this section. I've unfortunately had to cut out a lot of my comments and things like that because there is just so much to say. And also we want to talk about how Auschwitz was made into a museum. So if you head to a Patreon account, you will have all that info up there. And that would be really interesting because I take up another 10-15 minutes, and there's 2 testimonies in there that we didn't get a chance to put into this episode. So there is just so much to talk about post-war stuff. And Chris and I will be posting much more stuff into our Patreon because, you know, we still have another podcast coming out in April on a whole different other topic. And in the meantime, we'll still be able to put stuff in there about Auschwitz. Maybe we'll get some stuff in there on the Warsaw Uprising if you're really interested. We'll get a poll up there so you guys can tell us what you want. Do head to our Patreon page and we will see you there, and we will see you for one last episode, which will be next episode, where we'll be talking about post-war trials. Thank you so much, everybody.